As of today, it will henceforth be the official policy of the United States government that there are only two genders, male and female.
Well, good morning, Neil.
Happy Friday. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day to you. And are you of the opinion that Valentine's Day is only for the beloved, or are you one of those like, Valentine's Day is for friends and other people you love too?
I'm actually of the philosophy that it's not for the beloved; it's sort of for everyone else,
Okay.
especially nieces and nephews. So I delivered some Valentine's treats to them this
Aw.
morning.
Aw.
Nate and I do not participate in this holiday, manufactured by big business and I don't know, the heterosexual military empire or something like that.
Yes, Nancy has been telling me for 40 years that she doesn't believe in Valentine's Day. So, but I'll wish you a happy Valentine's
Oh,
Day.
right back at you. Oh my gosh.
Okay.
How did you create that? That's amazing.
I've been watching Taylor Swift for months. Okay, so let's get back to the news, which is terrible as usual, Neil. Today's top story is Danielle Sassoon, the top prosecutor in the Southern District, who has resigned in the face of Trump lackey Emil Bove III, demanding that she drop the corruption case against New York City Mayor Eric Adams in exchange for Adams giving full cooperation for the administration's deportation agenda. And Sassoon was a Scalia clerk. What's the significance of this, Neil?
I mean, first of all, God bless her. It's just so refreshing to see the few
Yep.
remaining people of principle on the right, such as Sassoon, a Trump appointee, a Scalia clerk, certainly, I mean, I think in every measure, a conservative,
Right.
but one that apparently still believes in the rule of law. And I don't know. I'm just really grateful for a person like that. Although, of course, her stepping down means that there's one less person inside these places to hold the line. But I mean, her resignation letter spells out the corruption itself and also applies the law that makes that clear. I don't see how anyone defends what's happening here. But of course, I'm sure,
Right.
she's going to be the pariah on the right and probably will have her life under threat. And Fox News will do its spinning around what this story actually is about.
Right. Well, and of course, Emil Bove has done what, is now a typical Trump administration move, which is he actually explicitly said to her, we're doing this because in exchange, Mayor Adams will cooperate with our immigration policy. And of course, as Sassoon wrote back, he has to. This isn't a deal. And
Right.
I believe that Eric Adams is guilty. And Bove is saying, well, that doesn't really matter. But, I think what seems so important here is Sassoon is saying, I believe he's guilty, therefore I cannot go before a judge in all good faith and say he's not.
Right. Yeah.
So, and of course, the Southern is famous. They just don't bring a case unless they've got someone dead to rights, and they win, over 95% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in other bad news, Elon Musk began the project of dismantling the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on Wednesday by firing more than 70 probationary employees. And I think what that means is they were not yet in the union. It's worth noting that Musk is attempting to launch a cash app himself. I think it's called X Money or X Cash or something like that. Something that would have been regulated by the CFPB. So he's actually eliminating the regulatory body that would hold his financial instrument to account. I'd also like to note that the CFPB has, in its short lifetime, returned more than $21 billion to consumers who have been preyed on by financial institutions. Neil, what do we think?
Yeah, it's just so completely obvious what Musk is doing. He's, attacking agencies that regulate his businesses. He's certainly not going after any of the government contracts that pour billions of dollars into his wallet. It's just so plainly obvious, and why there's not a bigger outcry over this, I don't know. But in terms of this particular bureau, one that's put $21 billion back in Americans' pockets, he's out there touting that it costs taxpayers, what is it, $800 million, and that should be returned to them, which I think works out to like, a handful of dollars for each of us. And that, again, conservative media is falling all over this, about that this is some, move of efficiency, and putting taxpayer dollars back in their accounts is just astounding. But all this is being done in plain daylight. Why work in the shadows when you can just carry this out in public and act like it's a service to the American people? It's wild.
Right. And of course, Republicans and some Democrats, I suspect, have hated the CFPB from the beginning.
Yeah.
It was, of course, the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren before she was a senator. She brought it to the Obama administration. The Obama administration wasn't so crazy about it, but they pushed it through. And it has been a terrific consumer protection instrument. And let me just say, consumer protection has a very, very long history in the United States, and much of that history has been on the right. I mean, if we think about Theodore Roosevelt creating the FDA and the Pure Food and Drug Act, if we think about, the Elizabeth Dole did consumer protection in the 1960s, right? So consumer protection has been a women's thing all along. But it's also been very much a Republican conservative agenda to keep Americans safe. And the cynicism at this point of just saying, oh, well, companies would never do that, when in fact they've done it to the tune of $21 billion. Disgusting pigs. Okay. So on Wednesday, Tulsi Gabbard's nomination for Director of National Intelligence passed the Senate on a 52-48, mostly party line vote. Only poor, broken down, headed for the exits, Mitch McConnell voted against a woman who is a well-known conspiracy theorist and a Russian asset. Neil, what are we going to do about this?
This is terrible. It's terrifying. I think, and this is also happening pretty much within a 24-hour window in which Trump held that phone call with Putin. And Russian state media is celebrating all of this as victories for Russia, which should send chills down every American spine of what all this means and what this represents, and our abandonment of Ukraine, our further isolation, our pulling away from Europe, and the propping up of Russia and Putin's message and strategy is insane. I mean, this is really scary to me.
Right. I think it's scary too. And there's sort of two things I think about. One is Ukraine has just been breaking my heart ever since the beginning of the war. I mean, I just couldn't believe it had happened. When the war started, I had quite recently spent a summer teaching in Eastern Europe. So I had a lot of students who were in proximity to the violence, some of whom were Russian, who have gone to live in Berlin. And I think, what's particularly horrible at this moment is it's clear that the Biden administration's strategy for defending Ukraine and negotiating an end to the violence did not work. But what's going to happen now is that Putin will be rewarded for what he's done to everyone, including what he's done to his own country. And there will be nothing going forward to rethink, well, what do we do when he does it again? And of course, as you're pointing out, with Gabbard in charge of DNI and Hegseth in charge of defense, what we're seeing is people openly saying, no, Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO, which is would be a horrifying outcome.
Horrifying. And also, I think the larger politics of Russia in this country, especially on the right, is really concerning. I mean, was it yesterday, J.D. Vance saying that I mean, sort of applying a relativist framework to this
Right.
Ukraine-Russia conflict and saying, I'm just opposed to this notion that Ukraine is the good guy and Russia is the bad guy here.
Right.
It's much more complicated than that. I mean, this is insane
Right.
coming from an American leader. And also, it's very much part of what has been happening over really since 2016 and the way that Russia and Putin have shaped the American right to its favor.
Right. Well, and the ways that people like J.D. Vance, and we're going to talk about this a little later in the show, are reshaping history. I mean, Vance saying there was no good guy here actually incorporates Russian propaganda, the propaganda that what Russia was really doing was fighting fascists,
Yes.
right? And that the Ukrainian regime was a fascist regime, which was completely and utterly false. It was a democratic regime. The nation has some problems with fascism, as we do too here in North America. But it was a democratic regime. And so Vance is rewriting that story to say, well, there were bad people on both sides. Okay, so a little closer to home, we've seen that a Massachusetts district judge has cleared the way for Donald Trump's buyout program for federal employees, or maybe we should just call it Elon Musk's program, saying that the union that represents them lacks standing to sue. So about 75,000 workers have accepted the offer to leave the government. And I did want to point out, I'd be interested in what you think about this, Neil, that generally over 100,000 federal workers retire every year anyway. Now, my guess is the people who are leaving may not be replaced, but maybe they will be. I don't know. How should we take this news, Neil?
Well, I think it's hard to know how to take this news because there's such a lack of clarity about what this all means in terms of a political objective for the Trump
Right.
administration. And then there's also been these reports that people who have raised their hand to retire have then been met with silence about what they're supposed to do. And so
Right.
it's an example of like there being complete inefficiency in this administration and incompetence in how it operates.
Right.
And also that like it also seems to me a little bit representative of what Elon Musk is doing in terms of this audit of the government or this him acting like he's brought this new level of transparency when all of a sudden he's saying his folks have found, oh, you won't believe that this is what USAID has paid for.
Right.
When all of that information was available and public
Right.
all along. They're acting
Right.
like they're doing these new things, that everything they're doing is discovery and is
Right.
exposing corruption, when it's actually just they're learning about it for the first time and making it and then turning
Right.
that into some sort of news story for the right.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. I think, the other thing, and I just want to, put on my history hat for a second here. The civil service was a Republican reform.
Yeah.
And we get the civil service in the late 19th century in response to Democratic Party corruption, specifically in the North, where, party machines like Tammany Hall would hand out jobs, many of which were no-show jobs, to totally unqualified people as rewards for getting them back into office and for organizing voters and so on. So the Republican Party really acts as the party of reform in the late 19th century in creating a standard for people who run the administrative state. So again, this is like a real sign that the Republican Party has abandoned its own history in pursuit of other goals, right?
Definitely. And I mean, I think it's not surprising that Musk and Trump would not know about the history or care about it if they did. But in terms of the overall party trajectory, it's just yet another example
Right.
of we're talking about a completely different political party here now that Trump is
Right.
at its helm.
Right. So, Neil, let's switch to a tragedy of a different kind. And we've been circling around this for weeks and thinking about, when are we going to get to this issue? There's been so much happening, and we finally planted a flag this week, which is the attacks on transgender people by the Trump administration. Donald Trump announced in his inauguration speech that he was going to sign an executive order saying that there were only two genders, male and female. The final EO said that those genders were assigned at conception, which is
Not scientific.
not scientific, right? I mean, listeners, if you don't know, testes and a rudimentary penis do not appear in an embryo until 7 weeks. So actually, everybody's female at conception, which is kind of cool, I think. Um, so Neil, what has stood out for you as key moments that our listeners should be thinking about and maybe acting on?
Well, as someone who's written a lot about the anti-abortion movement, I just have to sort of pause on this at conception language, because I
Right.
think it just shows the sort of broad application of a sort of theological worldview that has been made scientific on the right.
Right.
And I think that that's very much, that was just such a reflexive um, discursive choice on part of people who obviously are not versed in science to write something like that. But I think, lots of things are happening here. And one thing that we've talked about whenever this has come up is that I think, if you talk about the transgender issue right now, there's lots of different issues at play. I mean, this is a movement in which it has many fronts right now and many sort of different legal and political fights that it's engaged in. And I think if you look at public opinion around those individual issues, they're really all over the place. And so
Right.
we can sort of acknowledge the broad complexity of this issue as it plays out in American life. What I think is striking is that none of that complexity is reflected in the Trump playbook here. I mean, it is an
Right.
across the board attack on trans rights. It doesn't seek to like differentiate any of these individual issues or think about how those might play out separately among the American people. This is a wholesale attack on people, a whole category of people's individual freedoms that I think is ultimately aimed at their eradication. That they don't exist as a category of
Right.
person in this country, either legally or really even in sort of cultural consciousness.
Right. No, I agree with you. And I think there are two things that came to my attention this week that really underline that graphically. One is the continuing attacks on Sarah McBride. But recently, Sarah McBride, who is a transgender representative from the state of Delaware, incredible human being who keeps saying, look, I'm not in Congress because I'm transgender. I'm in Congress because of the state of Delaware. And she has really maintained that.
Yeah.
But she gave her maiden speech in the well of the House, and she was introduced by Mary Miller, a Republican from Illinois, Illinois 15 to be precise, if you live in Illinois 15, was introduced as the gentleman from Delaware, Mr. McBride, which just took my breath away that somebody would go all mean girls on the House floor and think that was okay.
Yeah, I mean, the ugliness of this is just, I mean, it really does take your breath away. Like, as people pointed out, there were other options here. Like, if you don't want to properly gender McBride, she could have said the congressperson, right? There's
Right.
sort of gender neutral language that one might use here, but this is just pure ugliness for, all the clicks and the likes on social media and probably good fundraising potential as well.
Right.
But the dehumanization of a fellow member of Congress, I think it's not surprising, but it is pretty shocking in terms of its just crassness.
Yes, it certainly is. And of course, it has nothing to do with any kind of policy that actually matters, although they've
Right.
worked hard on trying to say it does. I want to go back to what you were saying about really just trying to make trans people disappear, that there is no such thing. And you will hear people like Trump saying, not to mention Laura Ingraham and other sort of bomb throwers on X, saying, actually, if anybody says they're trans, actually what they are is mentally ill, because there is no such thing. And of course, that became graphic yesterday when the US Park Service eliminated any reference to transgender people from the website on the Stonewall National Monument. I mean, it's not just that trans people don't exist now for them. Let's just take them out of history. Neil, what?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Stonewall example is interesting. I mean, I think what it was a week ago that the federal government's website removed the TQ from any of the
Right.
LGBTQ stuff that it has up, and it's sort of amazing that it still has anything up to begin with. But I think this also just might be step one of the eventual erasure of all LGBTQ people. But I mean, this has been a movement that's been growing on the right for a long time, especially for the last decade. And a lot of right of center gay and lesbian persons have facilitated this development as well. So I think that's an important part of this story. It's certainly something I cover in my recent book.
Well, and also that you were a source for a recent article in GQ where the reporter went to a holiday party of log cabin Republicans, and they were actively enthusiastic about throwing trans people under the bus. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that piece, because it's a really good article and we should link to it.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece by Daniel Lefferts, who's a novelist, but who's written this really smart piece about really gay Republicans in the Trump era, and it opens with him attending this holiday party in New York shortly after, obviously, the 2024 election. And they're ecstatic about Trump's victory, and they're very celebratory about what I think a lot of us would see the anti-trans politics that they imagine the Trump administration will carry forward, and that we already know it has in these opening weeks. And I think that this is something that, my book touches on a little bit in its conclusion, that the trans issue it's been a subject of debate within the gay Republican movement. It no longer seems like a subject of debate anymore. I mean, it seems like they have thoroughly come down on the side of opposing anything that's trans related, which is a real departure from an earlier stance that they had, which was to separate out any issues involving underage children from what they call like legitimate trans issues for adults. And but I think if they want to continue to have a place within the Republican media sphere and within the sort of Trump GOP, taking a hardline stance on trans issues is going to be required. They just don't think it's ever going to bite them in the face. I mean, they really think that there is a sharp, stark line between TQ issues and the LGB issues. And I do not believe that that is the case. Claire, am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong, but I would also say that has been a big discussion among liberals for a long time and among trans people. And so there have been any number of moments in which trans people have sort of explicitly said, how did we get thrown into a bucket around sexuality when actually this is not about our sexuality? And you really see that slip happening in the conversation of people saying sexuality when they mean gender. Being trans is not about your sexuality, although trans people are often sexual people. They are sometimes asexual people. They are sometimes lesbians. They are sometimes gay men. But it's really not about sexuality. And so trans people have been sort of provoking that for a while. And I think the answer to the question has always been because we are all in danger. And so the fact that we are all in danger means that we have to stick together. And then I think what has also happened since the 1990s, thank you very much, Judith Butler, is the proliferation of genders and sexuality. So that very often what you'll see is LGBTQIA plus, so that nobody gets left out. And so no community deserved to have this hell brought down on it, and particularly the children involved, which I think is just heartbreaking. The children and the parents who are now being pilloried and forced to fly all over the country to get medical care. I do think it's an excellent example of something broader that happened on the American left, which is the presumption that our standards for political identity and political behavior would hold no matter what. And so I think a lot of organizations like GLAAD have been kind of caught off guard by this. I think that they're not quite sure what to do. I haven't seen the AHA, American Historical Association, responding to the Stonewall thing, although I wrote them today and asked them if they would please do so. Um, and I also called my senators and I called my congressman, who I now have on speed dial, to say, do something. And if you need some help, I know 100 historians who will help. But I think it's a tough thing to respond to because the Trump administration's capacity to simply exclude and demonize and criminalize people is far greater than the capacity of historians to be heard, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think just to bring back in that development that you pointed to, which is um, the use of, bringing in the sort of medicalization of these people as mentally ill,
Right.
which has become the dominant way that the Trump administration talks about this, and which is obviously coming out of, conservative circles and conservative
Right.
media that's been saying those things for many years now. I think that is an interesting and really scary development here, because if that is the case, then I think like this doesn't stop just with names being removed from a
Right.
historical marker, right?
Right.
I mean, we could imagine forced medical treatments,
Right.
forced, confinements of persons. I think once you bring this sort of once this becomes normalized, I think it's really dangerous to think about where it's headed, because maybe it's not just erasure, but it's something even more sinister.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, I'm also struck by the the trans ban in the military, which,
Mm.
Trump did that before, Biden rescinded it, it's been done again. But the language is very much like the language that was used to bar gays and lesbians from the military ages ago, which is this is a question of readiness, this is a question of honesty and honor, and so on. And, they did about 3 different studies about lesbians and gays in the military. The most recent one, I think, was in the Bush administration. Every single study came up with what you and I actually know about gay and lesbian people and trans people too, which is we are such fucking overachievers, right? I
Yes.
mean, it's like we have responded to discrimination much like Black people have responded to racial discrimination, which is I actually have to be better than anyone else to get someone to say I'm even okay. So, and that's basically what these studies came up with, is that gay and lesbian soldiers were exemplary, and that's what we're seeing with trans soldiers. They're exemplary. Now, I am happy to say that there are 5 transgender service members who have sued the Trump administration over this, and it should be locked up in court for a while. But it doesn't mean that actually life is not going to regress for trans people in the service.
Yeah, again, I just think that here as a historian, hearing this discourse of military readiness, troop morale, and unit cohesion,
Right,
that is a recurring argument used against any sort of changes for the military in terms of
right,
expanding its demographics. And we
right,
also know that the military has been um, one of the most, or the most important institutions of civil rights change in our
right,
country, even as it's also often been a very difficult place for those rights to have been achieved. It's been fundamental for that progress across the 20th century. And I think you're right that these, obviously it's going to be tied up for a while in court cases. Um, but I think if they make the arguments around military cohesion and what is it, unit cohesion, military readiness, and troop morale, um, they will do well to win these cases. The transgender persons will,
right,
because those have been won for other people around those same issues in the past.
right.
We'll see, though. I mean, obviously, it's a different court system than it was, even a decade ago.
Sure. Although I would say that, I mean, just to toss another thing in here, that the military is also one of the great engines of economic mobility in the
Yeah.
United States. And with the all volunteer military, we now have a system in which people are incentivized with education, with training.
Mm.
You can get up to $100,000 to put into your education. And of course, J.D. Vance did. And there are any number of veterans in Congress who did, who went through college and law school on military benefits. And so there's a much greater denial of citizenship here. Again, much akin to the ways in which gays and lesbians were kicked out of the military in World War II and thus did not gain access to the GI Bill, in which Black people were kicked out of the military dishonorably in the 40s and 50s. In a disproportionate way, and thus did not gain access to GI Bill benefits. So it is also a way of marginalizing transgender people further, and transgender people are per capita poorer than people who aren't transgender. Um, it's a way of marginalizing them further, and so there's sort of broader aspects of economic discrimination connected to this.
Hmm.
So Neil, um, let's look at um, other aspects of this ban. Um, it was launched against children, but it quickly became clear that it had ramifications for adults. And this is a tough question, Neil, but how do we connect the cultural story here, the efforts of the Republican Party to build a narrative of deviance around transgender people? How do we pin that to the larger culture war that they're waging?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you look at this historically, children have always figured prominently in these cultural battles as sort of the origin point of a
Mm-hmm.
larger assault on individual freedom. So if you think about the anti-gay efforts in the 1970s, Anita Bryant, Save Our Children, this
Right,
idea in South Florida that, gay gay teachers in the public classrooms are going to be predators, both sort of physically and ideologically upon
right,
young people's bodies and minds.
right,
And of course, that was about an entry point into a broader assault on LGBTQ, or at the time, gay and lesbian rights as they were being formed in the decade. And so once again, I think children serve as a uh, really easy test ground, or a really sort of easy starting place to to build broad public support, because who doesn't want to protect children,
right, right,
right? And actually, if you don't want to protect children, you're easily characterized as deviant and
right,
dangerous and sick,
right,
whether or not you have any connection to the actual issue. But then once that sort of cultural support is built for a narrow issue, it's just so, we've seen again, historically, time and time again, it's so easy to then widen it
right,
um, into less popular areas that are related to it, but that I think have been made much easier to accomplish
right.
because of that starting point.
Right. Well, and I think this is also where the get men out of women's sports
Mm,
conversation has gone, because I saw a lot of people that I know who were liberals who
yeah,
were saying, "Well, I don't want boys playing on my girls' sports team. I don't want my girls to have to compete against boys." And it's like, wait, first of all, they're not boys. Second of all, this is not happening. I mean, I remember when Ohio passed its ban on trans girls being on girls' sports teams. There was exactly one girl in the entire state of Ohio who wanted to run on a track team, right? Which doesn't involve much bumping and jostling and tripping and hitting. And everyone was like, oh, danger, danger. But the other thing we've seen, and I'd like to see more stories about this, is these laws became part of the parents' rights discourse
yes,
and made it possible for parents to lodge protests on the site of a competition and say, that athlete who says she's a girl is too good to be a girl. I want her to so there are all of these provisions in the laws for making actually adolescents and younger have to strip down and go through a medical examination and talk about their menstrual periods, which is, in my view, actual child abuse.
Yeah, I mean, such a violation of one's privacy, and yeah, it does feel abusive. One of the things that strikes me is, I mean, you're just pointing out, Ohio one case. I mean, I think there's actually lots of states that have passed this legislation where there's actually been zero cases.
Right.
And I think there are advocates there say, well, we're stopping this before it starts, and
Right.
I guess you can understand that as a legislative objective. But I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, I feel like maybe I should write about this, but we read this really terrific editorial in the New York Times titled Trump's Shameful Campaign Against Transgender Americans, and we should link to it. But one of the points that they make is, and I'll just quote directly from it, they are a minuscule less than 1% of the American population, speaking about
Right.
transgender persons, and they are 0.002% of college athletes, a population that's been especially incendiary in the culture wars. And I think that this question of numbers is so interesting, because if you think back to the history, especially of sort of the gay and lesbian rights movement in the 1980s and the 1990s, that was so invested in saying that gay and lesbian persons represented 10% of the population.
Right.
And then the conservative objection to that was, no, that 10% is a myth, that in fact it's much closer to 1%, that there was this battle over like, how
Right.
big are we? How many are we?
Right.
And what you're having now is the inversion of that, right? On the right, this is like, everyone is transgender. This is a problem that is like overwhelming the nation. And you have like defenders or supporters of trans persons saying, but actually there's not that many of them.
Right.
And I think that that's sort of this really interesting,
Right.
that's this really interesting history that has to do with like representation and visibility, but the way that they've sort of played out differently for each side in these and over the course of this history.
Right. And, there are a couple of other interesting things here that I want to point out before we close. One is how little trans men come up in this conversation.
Yes.
It's always about protecting women and girls, which is, of course, a right-wing trope. I mean, you go back to the Nazi Party, you go back to Theodore Roosevelt, who was, protecting women and girls from nasty black men and, blah, blah, blah. The protection of women and girls is it's a way of making the position unassailable. But no one's interested in trans men. Trans men playing football, is that something we're going to focus on? And you see the occasional trans man, making a video on TikTok saying, "Hey, you want me in the women's bathroom? Bring it on." But I haven't really seen Democrats or the advocates for trans people taking that one on. And I sort of think they don't know how to do it in a way that makes sense to ordinary Americans. Um, and then the other thing I'd like to point out is that I don't think anyone took it seriously how important sports are now
Yes.
to bourgeois people in their idea of how their children are going to have a future. And, for some reason, nobody's paying attention to the fact that every bougie kid is on 3 teams, 2 of them are travel teams, and that this is supposed to track them into an elite college and success. So the part of what I think is being mobilized here is, sort of an idea of advancing your child in the world being stolen by somebody who doesn't deserve it.
Completely. I mean, I'm sitting here in my hometown where I almost every night of the week go to one of the sports events of my niece and nephew. And I'm surrounded by lots of wealthy white families that have just devoted their lives to their children's sports in a way that feels so unrecognizable from
Right.
my growing up in this same town,
Right.
30 years ago, when you had like one sport maybe that you played that was part of making
Right.
you like a well-rounded individual, right? Like we're past, and I think that's relevant here, right? Like
Right.
that we're not crafting well-rounded individuals anymore, but we're
Right.
like, this is an arms race.
Right.
And also that I think is sort of fueled, especially among white wealthy people, that like all the odds are stacked against them. Like the
Right.
system has now been stacked against them. And maybe sports is the last sort of meritocratic ground upon which, true achievement can be judged.
Right.
And now this is happening. It's yet
Right.
another sort of social engineering of the system. I mean, I think that's sort of the thought process for a lot of Americans around this issue.
Well, and I would also note in closing that with all of the vicious attacks on affirmative action and all the vicious attacks on people of color as undeserving applicants to elite colleges,
Yeah.
we haven't seen Republicans really take on the question of athletic preference, right? I mean, they admit at some small liberal arts colleges there are 50 kids who they admit because they play football well.
Right.
So I think it's interesting that there's been an absence around that because anyway, I'll leave it there. Let's turn to what we want to go viral. Neil, how about you?
All right. Well, you already mentioned the GQ piece that I'm featured in, but I'm just going to do a little more log rolling here and mention
Okay.
another piece that I got featured in a lot this week that I'm thrilled
Yay.
about. And it's similar to the GQ piece. It's from USC Annenberg Media, written by Haley Mecklin, who's a senior at USC. And this piece is titled "The Normal Gay Guys of California's Republican Party." If I remember correctly, the GQ piece also had "normal gay" in the title. And of course,
Yep.
"normal gay" is taken from something that JD Vance said right a couple of days before the election, because he was on, I believe, Joe Rogan, and he was talking about how he expected that Trump would actually win with the normal gays.
Right.
And so that's become this really interesting concept that I think is resonant with like so many themes that I explore in my book about the history of gay Republicans. But, one of the things I will just say, it would be great if listeners or watchers read both of these pieces, because the GQ piece is really set in New York, and this one is set in California, and both California and New York, as I explore in my book, especially California, are fundamental to the history of gay Republicans.
Right.
In a lot of ways, that's not surprising, because those are two states that have historically had really centers of LGBTQ life between New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and also states that, despite their current political, image or even representation in contemporary politics, have long histories of republicanism and strengths for the Republican Party. And so I think it's really interesting to see these two stories about gay Republicans in two states that I think, in most readers' minds are coded as like deeply democratic.
Right.
But also how that operates for gay Republicans in both places as a form of what they believe is the sort of overwhelming liberal environments that they're responding to, not only being like in
Right.
blue states, but also that they are members of a particular demographic community that is overwhelmingly liberal. And so these notions of identity and politics are, I think, especially interesting when we think about gay Republicans, but I think are sort of big themes of both of these pieces. So check them out. Oh, and one of the things that I think that this author made a really interesting point about that I'm going to think a lot more is she writes, she's sort of pointing out that gay Republicans didn't amount to much of an electoral win for Trump in 2024, but that like they're sort of can be seen along the lines of Black male voters and Latino voters, who, especially Latino men, and white women without college degrees, who did support Trump by bigger margin than I think a lot of people would expect. And she writes, while Republicans have criticized the left's focus on identity, the rise of these communities indicates a shift toward micro-identity politics in American conservatism under Trump. And I think that notion of micro-identity politics in American conservatism under Trump is a really smart one, and one I'm going to be thinking about a lot and watching for a lot more over these next 4 years.
Yeah, it really, really good. And I would also sort of point our listeners back to histories of the early gay rights movement where people purposely costumed themselves as normal gays. And in
Right.
a way, it was riffing off the sit-in movement from the civil rights movement of the 1950s, where, activists would go into Woolworths wearing coats and ties, looking like respectable Black people, and then offer themselves up to be horribly abused while they sat at the counter. So partly the gay civil rights movement is doing that, but partly it's that they wanted to project themselves as not crazy people, and so the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society, Frank Kameny in Washington, every time they demonstrated, it would be like coats and ties, dresses and purses, high heels, hair set, and so on. So there's a long history to the normal gay. And it's really worth thinking about how the normal gay is rising to prominence again, but this
Yeah.
time on the right exclusively. So I want to talk today or end this episode with a slightly more cheerful piece by Sadiba Hassan in the New York Times, which is called "How Not to Be Cynical About Valentine's Day." And what Hassan talks about is how depressed a lot of people get if they're not in love on Valentine's Day, or if they don't have a partner, or if they don't have a date, or how a lot of people who are in couples feel really pressured by Valentine's Day to do something special when actually they're just exhausted from the holiday season. And Hassan suggests that we use Valentine's Day to celebrate love in other forms, to celebrate our friends, to celebrate our parents, our siblings, our nieces and nephews, as you're doing. And that Valentine's Day can be a nice day to contemplate kindness and the ways that people in our lives contribute to our happiness. And she says, she actually puts some of the blame on television, both on raising people's expectations about Valentine's Day, but also, crafting these narratives about how people dread it. And she's saying, pull away from popular culture for 2 seconds and go on a date with one of your friends on Valentine's Day. And I just thought it was such a lovely thing to write because romance nowadays has become so elusive for so many people. Fewer people are getting married. Apparently, the marriage rates in China have dropped again. So people in
Wow.
China are having like a horrible Valentine's Day. Um, but most importantly, hoping that love will come to you someday can keep you from experiencing the love that's all around you that just isn't focused on coupledom and forming a marriage and a future. And she says, yearning for a partner is a normal feeling, but it's also okay to make that one of several feelings that attach to love. So, what do you think, Neil?
I'm gonna have to read this. I mean, I'm all for taking the air out of Valentine's Day, or at least maybe us like redirecting how we imagine it and how it operates in our culture. But the rise of Galentines in the last
Yeah.
decade or so, I think,
Yep.
is one sort of response that sort of aligns with what this author is arguing. But I think that I love this much more expansive vision of what it might mean. That it might be that we might think about like love in its multiple forms, and it seems to me all the more so do we need to do so right now. Like sort of to expansively think about what love might mean
Hmm.
in a collective way, and in a community-based way, and in a networked way, in addition to the romantic way, which we have like way too many way too much focus on. But
Yeah.
it seems like love is a form of resistance right now. If we can imagine if we can imagine it as expansively as possible.
Yeah. Agree totally. More love. We need more love. And on that note, Neil, I'll see you next week.
All right, sounds good. Have a great one.
You too.